The desperate plea. In the cold, vast expanse of space, a lonely distress signal drifted through the cosmos. It was a simple message, but its implications were far from simple. An alien civilization, once proud and powerful, now teetered on the edge of annihilation. Their planet, a shimmering jewel of technology and culture, was crumbling under the weight of relentless invaders. The atmosphere had turned toxic, the oceans poisoned, and the once glorious cities lay in ruins. Their enemies, a relentless force from a neighboring galaxy, had no mercy. They had already destroyed most of their world and were closing in on the last few survivors. Desperation clung to the air as the leaders of this broken civilization huddled in their command center, surrounded by flickering screens and dying monitors. The alien species known as the Xendari were on the brink of extinction. Their advanced technology had once made them feared throughout the galaxy, but now they were helpless, their once proud fleets scattered or destroyed. Their final hope lay in the hands of a simple plea, a distress signal broadcast across the stars, hoping that someone, anyone, would come to their aid. The Xendari had made many enemies in their time, but they had never expected that their final hour would come at the hands of a ruthless alien species so far from their own galaxy. They had underestimated their adversaries, believing their power would always keep them safe. But now, with their cities reduced to rubble and their last defenders scattered across the dying world, the Xendari were forced to beg for help. Their ancient records spoke of a distant planet, one that had once been neutral in the affairs of the galaxy, Earth. But no one knew if humans would respond. For years, Earth had been a mystery to the greater galactic community. Its inhabitants were considered primitive by many, with only limited technology compared to the great spacefaring civilizations. Some speculated that Earth had not even developed space travel. Others believed it was just another quiet, insignificant planet in a far corner of the galaxy, lost in the endless expanse of stars. But the Xendari knew that Earth was their last chance. They had heard rumors of humanity's resilience, of their ability to survive against impossible odds. Perhaps, just perhaps, the humans would see the Xendari's suffering and come to their aid. Desperation clouded their judgment, and so the message was sent, loud, clear, and unyielding. The distress signal was simple. It called for help, explained their dire situation, and offered whatever resources they could give in return. But deep down, the Xendari knew that their chances of survival were slim. They were too weak, too broken, to make demands or bargains. All they could do was hope. Hope that the humans would hear their cry, that they would be willing to help. As the signal reached the vast emptiness of space, the leaders of the Xendari waited, holding their breath. The seconds stretched into minutes, then hours, with no response. The silence was deafening. Were the humans even listening? Did they even know of the Xendari's existence? Then, just as despair began to settle over the command center, a faint blip appeared on the monitors. The signal had been received. The Xendari leaders rushed to the console, their hands trembling with anticipation. Would this be their salvation? The screen flickered, and a new message appeared. It was short, direct, and it sent chills down the spines of every Xendari present. We hear you. Prepare for our response. The message came from Earth. But as the Xendari waited for the next transmission, they felt an unsettling sense of unease. They had expected help, a promise of salvation. But the tone of the response was different. It was not the warm comfort they had hoped for. There was something cold, something distant in the words. Before they could process the message, another one arrived. This time, it was accompanied by a display of raw, terrifying power. A fleet of ships, massive and ancient, appeared in the system, cutting through space with a force that made even the Xendari's advanced sensors tremble. The ships were unlike anything the Xendari had ever seen. Their designs were not sleek and graceful like those of the Xendari's own ships. These ships were rough, battle-worn, and scarred, with jagged edges and dark, menacing lines. The ships looked ancient, more like weapons from a forgotten era than the sophisticated designs they were used to. And yet, despite their age, there was something unnervingly powerful about them. They were unlike anything that Xendari had ever encountered. A message flickered onto their monitors. The text was simple, yet the meaning was clear. Your request has been noted, but help comes at a cost. You are not welcome here. The Xendari's leaders froze in shock. What had they just heard? The humans were not offering aid. They were threatening them. What had they done to deserve such a response? Were the humans simply unwilling to help, or was there something else? The Xendari had hoped for salvation, but now it seemed they had unknowingly woken up a sleeping giant. Earth, once thought to be a peaceful and unassuming planet, had just revealed its true nature, a power far greater and more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. As the massive human warships loomed in the distance, the Xendari felt a cold fear that ran deeper than the void of space. They had made a grave mistake. In their desperation, they had called for help from the wrong species. Now there was no turning back. The Earth had spoken. The Xendari's plea for aid was not met with compassion. Instead, it had unleashed the wrath of a civilization that had been dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to show its true power. As the Xendari watched the human fleet draw closer, they realized the brutal truth. They had asked for help, but now they would face Earth's fury. This was no longer a battle for survival. It was a fight for dominance, and the Xendari had no idea what kind of war they had just started. The Xendari watched in stunned silence as the enormous human warships loomed closer, their dark silhouettes blocking out the stars behind them. The fleet was unlike anything they had ever imagined, ancient and weathered, yet brimming with an undeniable power. The Xendari leaders could feel the weight of the moment. They had sent out a distress call, desperate for help, but what they had received was far from the salvation they had hoped for. Instead of aid, they had awoken a force of unimaginable strength, a force that now stood ready to impose its will. The human fleet moved with purpose, not hesitation, as it cut through the void between their ships and the Xendari homeworld. The fleet was composed of vessels that seemed to defy logic, some appearing as old as time itself, others seemingly designed for total annihilation. They were armed to the teeth with weapons that glowed ominously, weapons that Xendari had never seen before, and each ship seemed to carry a history far darker than anything that Xendari could fathom. The Xendari's communication systems flickered again. A new message came through, this one chilling in its simplicity. Prepare for the consequences. There was no mercy in the tone, no compassion. The humans had heard their call for help, and now they had made their response clear. The Xendari were no longer in control of their fate. The tide of the battle had already shifted, and it seemed as though Earth was the one holding the cards. The leader of the Xendari, a tall and imposing figure named Alanok, felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen many battles in his time, faced down the most powerful enemies in the galaxy, but this was different. There was something about the human fleet that unnerved him. It was not the size of the fleet, nor the strength of the ships, but the way the humans had approached them. There was no negotiation, no attempt at diplomacy. There was only a chilling message and a fleet that was now moving toward them like an unstoppable force. Alanok, what do we do now? Asked one of his advisors, a nervous tremor in their voice. The desperation in the room was palpable. Alanok's eyes darted across the room, scanning the faces of his most trusted officers. They had already lost so much. Their cities were in ruins, their fleets shattered, and now, instead of salvation, they had received a warning, one that seemed to come from a civilization far more advanced and far more dangerous than anything they had ever known. We fight, Alanok said with a resolve he didn't feel. We do not let them take what little we have left. We will stand our ground. But even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't enough. Their warships were no match for the sheer power of the human fleet. The Xendari had once been known for their cutting-edge technology, but now, in the face of humanity's overwhelming might, they were little more than an ancient relic. The battle would be fierce, and the outcome uncertain. But one thing was certain. This was no longer about survival. It was about pride, about showing that they would not go down without a fight. As the human fleet drew closer, the Xendari commanders scrambled to prepare their defenses. Their remaining ships, although few, were armed with powerful weapons, some capable of devastating entire cities with a single shot. Yet, as the human ships closed in, it became increasingly clear that the odds were not in their favor. The humans had something that the Xendari lacked: strength and numbers. The Xendari could only hope that their technological edge, however diminished, would give them the advantage. The human warships began to form a tight formation around the Xendari fleet, their presence like a tightening noose. It was an eerie silence that surrounded them. There were no cries of battle, no explosions, just the steady hum of ships moving into position. The Xendari braced for impact, knowing that any moment now, they would have to make a choice: fight or flee. But even the most advanced technologies of the Xendari couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the air. "Sir, their ships are charging weapons," one of the Xendari officers shouted. The tension in the room skyrocketed as alarms blared and flashing red lights filled the command center. The moment of truth had arrived. Alanok's eyes narrowed. This was it. The human fleet had made their move. "Prepare to fire," he ordered, his voice unwavering. "Give them everything we've got." As the Xendari fleet unleashed their first volley of fire, the human warships did not flinch. Instead, they returned fire with devastating precision. The Xendari's weapons, although powerful, seemed insignificant against the onslaught of human firepower. The humans responded with ease, their ships effortlessly dodging and countering every attack. The Xendari shots were swallowed up by shields that seemed impenetrable, and before they could even adjust their tactics, the humans had already struck back. The first explosion tore through the Xendari ranks, and a massive warship, once the pride of their fleet, was reduced to a fiery debris cloud. Alanok's heart sank as he watched his people's greatest ship fall. It was a devastating blow, one that shook the resolve of everyone on board. The humans didn't stop. They didn't hesitate. Each shot that landed from their fleets seemed to carry the weight of years of preparation, a fury held back for far too long. The Xendari were no match for the sheer devastation being brought down upon them. As the chaos unfolded, Alanok knew that the war had already been lost. There would be no victory today. The humans had come, and they had come with a purpose that left no room for negotiation. They had not come to rescue, but to conquer. The Xendari had learned a harsh lesson that day. Earth's wrath was not something to be trifled with. They had sought help, but instead they had awoken a force capable of destruction beyond anything they had ever imagined. And now, the battle for their very survival had become a battle for Earth's supremacy. The Xendari had unleashed something far greater than they could handle, and now they would pay the price. The Xendari fleet, once a proud force that dominated the stars, was now a fragmented shadow of its former self. They had faced battles, yes, but never something like this. Never a force that seemed to move with such ruthless precision. The human warships continued to fire, their weapons sending shockwaves through the Xendari ranks, tearing through hulls, and breaking apart ships with terrifying efficiency. Alanok stood at the helm of his flagship, his mind racing. He had faced down threats before, but this was different. The humans didn't just fight. They fought to win. They didn't hesitate or falter. Their warships were unlike any he had ever seen, sleek, but with a presence that filled the battlefield. Their weapons didn't just destroy, they annihilated. It was as though Earth had unlocked some hidden force of nature, something that defied logic and reason. "Status report," Alanok barked, his voice hoarse. One of his officers quickly replied, panic evident in their voice. "We've lost 3 warships already, Commander. The humans. They're too powerful. Another officer interrupted, their hands shaking as they tried to control the rapidly deteriorating situation. Our weapons are barely scratching their shields. We can't hold out much longer. Alenok's gaze turned to the view screen, watching as one of the last remaining Centauri warships exploded in a fiery burst. The sight was horrifying, a reminder of the grim reality they were facing. He had never imagined it would come to this. The Centauri, a race known for its technological superiority, were now helpless against the might of Earth's fleets. "Return fire with everything we've got," Alenok ordered, though even he knew it might be too little too late. The Centauri fleet unleashed another barrage of fire, hoping that the sheer volume of their attacks would overwhelm the human ships. But once again, their weapons seemed ineffective. The humans danced around the barrage effortlessly, their ships moving with an agility that defied logic. The Centauri couldn't hit them, couldn't touch them. Alenok clenched his fists, his mind racing for a solution. There had to be a way to turn the tide, something that could stop this onslaught. They had once been the most feared species in the galaxy, but now they were the ones who were afraid. In the chaos, one of his officers, who had been monitoring communication channels, spoke up. "Commander, the humans are hailing us. They want to speak with you." The tension in the room grew thick. Alenok hesitated for a moment before giving the command. "Put them through." The screen flickered, and suddenly, a human appeared on the view screen. The figure was clad in a uniform, their face stern and unreadable. Alenok didn't need to be told who they were. The message was clear. Earth had arrived, and Earth was in charge now. "This is Commander Grayson of the Earth Defense Fleet," the human said, their voice calm and steady. "Your plea for help has been heard, but help is no longer on the way. You've made your choice. Now you will face the consequences." Alenok's chest tightened. The human's words struck him like a blade. This was no negotiation. There would be no peaceful resolution. The humans had come to assert their power, and they were doing it in the most devastating way possible. "We came seeking rescue," Alenok said, his voice strained. "We never intended to." "Intentions don't matter now," Commander Grayson interrupted, his voice cold. "You're on the wrong side of this war, and Earth doesn't forgive mistakes." The words cut deep. There was no mercy, no compassion in Grayson's voice. The humans had made up their minds, and Alenok knew there was nothing he could do to change it. They had come for vengeance, and there was no turning back. "We will fight," Alenok said, his voice filled with defiance. "We will not surrender to you." Grayson's expression didn't change. "You can fight all you want, but it won't save you. Earth does not forget. Earth does not lose." With that, the communication was cut off, leaving the Centauri fleet in a chilling silence. The sound of alarms and warnings filled the air, but it was all background noise to the crushing realization that Earth was now their enemy. And that enemy was relentless. In the following moments, the human fleet launched another wave of attacks, this time targeting the weakest ships in the Centauri fleet. The destruction was swift and unforgiving. The remaining warships of the Centauri tried to retaliate, but their firepower was nothing compared to the advanced weapons the humans had at their disposal. Another massive explosion ripped through the Centauri lines as one of their last remaining ships was torn apart. The Centauri fleet, now reduced to a mere handful of ships, tried to regroup, but it was clear that they were outmatched. Alenok knew that they could not keep fighting for much longer. There had to be a way to escape, some way to save what remained of his people. "Commander," one of his officers said, "we have a problem. The humans, they've begun to send boarding parties." A cold shiver ran down Alenok's spine. The humans weren't just destroying their fleet, they were coming for them. And with the Centauri fleet on the verge of collapse, there was nowhere to run, no place left to hide. The sound of the ship's alarms blared once more, a grim reminder that the end was near. Alenok's mind raced. Should they surrender? Should they attempt to flee? But the reality was undeniable. If they didn't act quickly, Earth's wrath would leave nothing behind but dust. And so, the Xendari were faced with a choice that would determine the fate of their people: fight to the bitter end, or flee into the unknown, hoping for survival. But deep down, Alanok knew that whatever choice they made, the cost would be high. Earth had shown no mercy, and there was little hope of escaping the wrath of the Deathworlders. Alanok stood before the viewscreen, watching as the last remnants of his fleet were destroyed one by one. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with the gravity of the situation. The cold, unfeeling words of Commander Grayson echoed in his mind. Earth does not forgive. Earth does not lose. Those words had cut deeper than any weapon could. His people, the proud Xendari, had once ruled the stars. Now they were reduced to nothing more than a desperate, broken fleet, running from the might of a world they had underestimated. Earth, a planet they had ignored, was now the very thing that threatened to wipe them out. Alanok turned away from the viewscreen and walked briskly toward the command center. His officers stood silently, the weight of their defeat heavy in the air. Their faces were grim, many of them barely able to hide the fear that had settled in their eyes. They had been trained for battle, trained to lead their people to victory, yet now they were faced with an impossible enemy that had no intention of giving them mercy. "Commander," one of his officers spoke up, breaking the tense silence. "We can't keep running. If we don't do something soon, it will be the end of us." Alanok nodded slowly. He had been thinking the same thing. The humans were relentless. Every attempt to fight back had been futile. But one option remained, an option that could buy them a chance at survival. "Is the escape plan ready?" Alanok asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "Yes," replied another officer, a flicker of hope in their eyes. "We've prepared the prototype ship, the Vanguard. It's capable of slipping past the human forces, but it's our only chance. Once we launch, we will be vulnerable." The Vanguard, a prototype that had been in development for years. It was their last hope, a ship designed to be faster and stealthier than anything that Xendari had ever created. But it wasn't perfect. Its weapons were limited, and it had only enough supplies for a small crew. If they failed to escape, it would be their final surrender to Earth's might. Alanok turned to the screen, his thoughts racing. Earth was closing in, their warships in position to wipe out what was left of the Xendari fleet. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, knowing that every decision he made from here on out would determine the fate of his people. "We launch at once," Alanok decided, his voice firm. "Prepare the Vanguard. We leave now." The officers scrambled into action, their movements urgent as they worked to prepare the last-ditch escape. Alanok took a deep breath, knowing that this was the only option left. If they stayed, they would be annihilated. If they fled, they might stand a chance, but the risks were monumental. As the crew worked frantically, Alanok's mind wandered back to their last conversation with the humans. The cold, ruthless tone of Commander Grayson had been unmistakable. He remembered how Grayson had said, "We will not stop until you are gone. Earth does not lose." Alanok's heart clenched. The humans had no intention of negotiating or showing mercy. There was no diplomacy, no room for reasoning. The Vanguard's engines roared to life, signaling that the ship was ready. The Xendari fleet had been crippled, and now it was up to this last, desperate attempt to escape. Alanok could feel the tension rising in the pit of his stomach. This would be a one-way journey, and the chances of success were slim. But they had no other choice. "Commander, the Vanguard is ready for launch," his lead officer announced. Alanok gave a nod. "Good. We launch in 5 minutes. Make sure every last member of the crew is aboard." He glanced out the window, his eyes meeting the burning wreckage of the Xendari ships. It was a heartbreaking sight. These ships had been their pride, their power, and now they were nothing but floating husks of metal. The humans had seen to that. "Commander, there's something else," one of the officers said hesitantly. "The humans, they're launching their boarding parties." Alanok's heart skipped a beat. The humans were coming for them directly. There was no more time. He had to act fast. "Prepare the Vanguard for immediate takeoff," he barked, his voice now tinged with urgency. "We're leaving now. We won't survive another minute here." The countdown began. As the final seconds ticked away, Alanok's mind raced. He had led his people into war, led them to a devastating defeat. But he had one last chance to save them, to give them a future, even if it meant running, even if it meant leaving behind everything they had ever known. The Vanguard began its launch sequence, and the ship slowly lifted off from the wreckage of the Xandari flagship. Alanok stood by the window, watching as the last remnants of their fleet were left behind. It was the end of an era. But the journey had only just begun. The Vanguard would have to navigate through treacherous space, evading the pursuit of the human fleet. They had to make it to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, where Earth's wrath might not reach them. As the ship streaked into the stars, Alanok couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. The humans would not stop until they were dead, and they had no intention of letting the Xandari escape. But for now, the Vanguard was their hope, their only chance, and Alanok swore, as the stars stretched out before him, that they would not let Earth's wrath be the end of their people. The Vanguard sliced through space, its engines roaring as it fled from the wreckage of the once mighty Xandari fleet. Alanok stood at the helm, his eyes glued to the vast expanse of stars ahead. The cold void of space had never felt so oppressive, and the silence surrounding them was deafening. But beneath the quiet, the fear in the hearts of the crew was palpable. They had escaped the human ship's immediate reach, but Alanok knew they were not safe. Not yet. "Commander, we've entered the outer rim," his navigator reported, voice tight with anxiety. "We should be able to lose them in the asteroid belt. It might buy us some time." Alanok nodded, but there was no comfort in the idea. The humans had proven themselves to be relentless and resourceful. No amount of space debris could stop them. He glanced out at the black void, feeling the weight of their situation bearing down on him. The Vanguard was their only hope, and the ship's engines were not limitless. The farther they went, the more strain they would place on the ship. If they didn't find a way to elude Earth's fleet, they would be caught, and it would be the end. "Keep us moving," Alanok said, his voice firm. "We cannot afford to slow down. Find the nearest outpost, anything that can help us." His officer looked back at him, fear flickering in their eyes. "Sir, there's nothing in range. The nearest station is weeks away. Then we'll have to outrun them," Alanok replied. "Continue evasive maneuvers. Keep scanning for any sign of human pursuit." The crew worked in a flurry of controlled panic, but Alanok knew the truth. The humans were following them. It was only a matter of time before they would catch up. Earth's fleet was vast, and their technology was advanced. The Vanguard might be fast, but it was not invincible. Hours passed, and the tension on the ship mounted. Alanok could feel it in the air. The officers were whispering among themselves, their voices carrying the anxiety they were all trying to hide. Even the crew members who were usually calm and collected seemed on edge, casting worried glances at their monitors and one another. "Commander," the voice crackled over the intercom. It was the communications officer, her voice laced with urgency. "We've detected a fleet coming up on our tail. It's the humans." Alanok's heart sank. He had hoped, even against all odds, that they had managed to slip past their pursuers, but it was not to be. "How far behind are they?" Alanok demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Approximately 3 light years," she replied. "They're closing in fast. They've deployed interceptors." His mind raced. 3 light years. They had little time to make a move. If the humans were deploying interceptors, it meant they were preparing to corner them, forcing them into a trap. Alanok clenched his fists, staring at the starry expanse before him, knowing that their window for escape was closing rapidly. "Can we outrun them?" he asked, turning toward his navigational officer. The officer hesitated, glancing at the readouts before shaking their head. "No, Commander. Their ships are faster. If we keep running, they will catch up eventually. Alanok cursed under his breath. There was no escape now, only a battle they had no chance of winning. But he couldn't give up. Not yet. There had to be another way. He glanced toward the nearby asteroid belt, a dangerous and treacherous region, filled with massive, shifting rocks that could tear a ship apart. But it was also the only chance they had left to evade Earth's relentless pursuit. We're heading into the asteroid belt, Alanok decided. All hands braced for impact. We may need to make a sudden jump to avoid their pursuit. Prepare for anything. The crew moved quickly, adjusting their positions and reinforcing the shields. Alanok felt a strange sense of resolve settle over him. This was their final chance. They could either fight and die or take the risk and live. But there was no time to waste. The Vanguard hurtled toward the asteroid belt, the massive rocks floating in their path like menacing giants in the darkness. The ship's speed increased as they neared the belt, and the crew held their breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when the ship would have to dodge, swerve, or risk a deadly collision. Incoming fire, the communications officer shouted, her voice shaking. They're targeting us. Alanok's eyes snapped to the view screen, and his heart raced as the first volley of human fire slammed into their shields. The ship shuddered violently, and the lights flickered, but the shields held, barely. The Vanguard surged forward, weaving and dodging through the incoming barrage. Get us through that belt, Alanok commanded, his voice tight. Use the rocks for cover. We can't let them lock onto us. The ship veered sharply, dodging massive asteroids that seemed to appear out of nowhere, their jagged surfaces threatening to tear the Vanguard apart. Alanok's hands gripped the controls tightly, sweat dripping down his face as the ship lurched and twisted through the maze of rocks. 1 minute, his officer said, her voice low. We'll be through the belt in 60 seconds. But if we make it through, they might lose us. Alanok knew that time was running out. They had to make it through the asteroid belt. It was their only chance. Hold on, Alanok shouted, steering the ship with all his strength. Don't stop. We can do this. The crew was silent, each one fully immersed in the tense task at hand. The Vanguard shuddered again as another round of human fire struck the shields, but the ship kept moving, narrowly avoiding massive asteroids that seemed to be coming from all directions. And then, with a final sharp turn, the Vanguard broke through the asteroid belt, emerging into open space once more. The ship was damaged, the hull scorched and battered, but it was still intact. The crew exhaled in relief, but there was no time to celebrate. The humans were still out there, and they had just been given a glimpse of Earth's relentless wrath. Get us to the jump point, Alanok ordered, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of their situation. We're not safe yet. The Vanguard raced forward, disappearing into the darkness of space, with the human fleet hot on their tail. The Vanguard was battered. The hull groaned under the strain of its dodging maneuvers, and the crew could feel every impact that rocked the ship. But there was no time to rest, no time to assess the full extent of the damage. Alanok stood at the command console, his face pale from exhaustion and fear, but his resolve was as unshakable as ever. The crew had done their best to outrun the humans, but the time for running was nearly over. The human fleet was no longer just a threat. They were closing in on them faster than Alanok had anticipated. He could see the ships, sleek and relentless, on his scanners. They were already preparing to engage, forming a tight formation that left no room for escape. Commander, his tactical officer spoke, his voice tight with the weight of the situation. The human fleet is within firing range. They'll launch another barrage any second. Alanok clenched his fists, fighting the rising tide of panic. How much longer before we reach the jump point? Another 30 minutes at best, the officer replied. But with their interceptors closing in, we won't make it unless we fight them off. The Vanguard had barely any firepower left. The shields were weakening, and the weapons systems were struggling to keep up with the barrage from Earth's fleet. If they didn't find a way to stop the humans now, there would be no jumping to safety. There would only be an inevitable fiery death. We can't outrun them. Alanok muttered to himself, the cold truth weighing heavily on him. The Vanguard could barely handle the damage it had sustained. They couldn't keep running. They had no choice now but to fight. Prepare for battle, Alanok ordered. Weapons back online. Shields at full power. We will make our stand here. The crew went to work in a flurry of motion, a surge of energy in their movements as they braced themselves for the inevitable clash. Alanok felt the ship's engines roar beneath his feet as they turned to face the oncoming human fleet. The Vanguard was no longer a ship fleeing from its enemies. It was now a ship preparing to meet them head-on. We've detected incoming fire, the communications officer reported, her voice tight with fear. They're launching heavy weapons. Shields won't last long. Alanok's jaw tightened. We need to buy some time. We need to make them hesitate. He glanced at the ship's navigational map. There was a plan, one that was risky but just might give them a fighting chance. It was a strategy born from desperation. Set the course for the debris field, Alanok ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. We'll use the debris as cover and make them waste their fire. Once we're in position, we'll strike back with everything we have. The crew's hands flew across their consoles, inputting the coordinates and rerouting power to the ship's remaining guns. The Vanguard veered toward the asteroid field, hoping that its shattered remnants would give them some sort of cover. As the ship neared the debris field, Alanok's mind raced with calculations. He knew that they had only one shot at this. If they could survive the initial assault, if they could hide in the debris long enough to make a counterstrike, they might just have a chance to escape. Hold steady, he murmured, gripping the control panel in front of him as the ship moved into the field. The human ships followed closely behind, their weapons already charging. A barrage of laser fire ripped through space, striking the Vanguard's shields with a deafening crash. The ship shuddered, the lights flickering as the shields absorbed the attack. It held, barely. We're almost there, the tactical officer said. We've entered the debris field. It's now or never. Alanok exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. Initiate evasive maneuvers. Keep moving. We have to make them think we're out of control. The Vanguard careened through the debris field, twisting and turning to avoid the floating rocks and the incoming fire from the humans. It was a chaotic wild dance, one that kept the crew on the edge of their seats. Alanok watched as the human ships closed in, but they seemed to hesitate. The debris field was giving them pause, slowing their pursuit. But they wouldn't stop for long. Ready the counterstrike, Alanok commanded. We've only got one shot. Let's make it count. The crew worked frantically, rerouting power to the Vanguard's remaining weapons. The ship's energy shields flickered under the strain of the human fire, but the crew knew they had no choice now but to go all in. The Vanguard emerged from the debris field, coming face to face with the human fleet. The weapons systems hummed to life, and Alanok barked his final order. Fire. The Vanguard unleashed a furious barrage of energy blasts. The first few shots missed, but the humans weren't expecting such a sudden attack. The first few rounds struck their ships, sending shockwaves through the fleet. The humans retaliated immediately, launching their own missiles and lasers, but the Vanguard was ready. Alanok's hands flew over the controls, evading the blasts with precision. The Vanguard had the element of surprise on its side, and the humans were struggling to adjust. We've hit their lead ship, the tactical officer called out, his voice breaking through the chaos. It's taking damage. Alanok smiled grimly. They were making a dent, but the battle was far from over. The humans would fight back harder now, and they had no idea how much longer their ship would hold together. We have to end this now, Alanok said, his eyes narrowing as he saw the human ships regrouping for another attack. He steeled himself for what was coming. The Vanguard had given everything it had, The next moments would determine whether they would live to see another day. The Vanguard shuddered violently as another barrage of fire crashed into its weakened shields. Alenok gripped the command console so tightly that his knuckles were white. He could feel the ship's groan as it fought to hold together. But it was clear now. The Vanguard couldn't withstand much more. They were running out of options. "We can't keep this up much longer," the tactical officer said, his voice filled with tension. "Shields are almost gone. Weapons are running dry." Alenok glanced around the bridge, his crew working furiously, their faces pale but determined. The Vanguard had already suffered so much. It had outlasted longer than anyone had hoped, but now, the inevitable was staring them in the face. The humans were coming, relentless, unyielding, and they weren't just going to let them go. "Commander," the communications officer called, her voice urgent. "The humans are trying to get a direct communication link. They want to talk." Alenok's gaze narrowed. "What are they offering?" "We don't know," she replied, her fingers flying across the console. "They're asking for a direct channel to you." Alenok hesitated. He knew what this could mean. It could be a trap, or worse, it could be an attempt to break their will. But if there was even the smallest chance of gaining an advantage, they had to take it. The Vanguard didn't have the luxury of pride anymore. "Open the channel," he ordered, his voice steady, despite the rising chaos in his chest. A moment later, the image of a human officer appeared on the screen. He was calm, wearing the standard uniform of Earth's fleet. His face was stern, but there was something about him that made Alenok uneasy. This wasn't a military officer who had any intention of negotiating. "I am Captain Nathan Rhodes of the Earth Fleet," the man said, his tone cold. "We've been tracking your vessel for days. It's time to end this." Alenok's eyes flashed with anger. He wanted to lash out, but he knew better than to show weakness in front of the enemy. "You've been hunting us down, human. What's your offer?" Rhodes smiled, though it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There's no offer, Commander. This is your final chance to surrender. You are outnumbered, outgunned, and running on fumes. You're already beaten." Alenok's jaw tightened. He had expected no less. He'd expected nothing more than the human arrogance. He knew it was their way, their pride, and their sense of superiority. "Then, you should know this," Alenok said, his voice low but resolute. "The Vanguard will never surrender. You'll have to destroy us to stop us." Rhodes' expression hardened. "Very well, Commander. If you wish to die with your ship, so be it. But know this, your people will never threaten Earth again." With that, the channel cut off, and the screen went black. Alenok stood in silence for a moment, as if the weight of the conversation had settled heavily upon him. But there was no time for contemplation. The humans had made their decision, and now it was up to him and his crew to make theirs. "Prepare for battle," Alenok said, his voice strong as steel. "We're going to make them regret ever thinking they could defeat us." The crew moved swiftly, their fear replaced with the cold determination of warriors facing their final moments. The Vanguard was battered and broken, but it wasn't done yet. Not while they still had the will to fight. The human ships were closing in fast. They had already seen the damage the Vanguard had inflicted, and now they would try to finish it. But Alenok's mind raced. He had one last chance, a move that would take everything he had. It was the last card he had to play. "Get me a direct link to the weapon systems," Alenok barked. "I'm going to give them everything we've got left." The crew scrambled to comply. The Vanguard's remaining energy was diverted to its weapon systems, every last ounce of power that could be spared. The ship groaned under the strain, but they were prepared to give it their all. The human fleet, their ships looming ever larger, was almost upon them. "Now," Alenok said, his voice low and dangerous, "we strike." With a furious roar, the Vanguard fired its remaining weapons. The energy blast slammed into the lead human ship with such force that it seemed to explode into 1,000 pieces. The other ships in the fleet scattered, their formations breaking apart in a desperate attempt to regroup. But the humans were not prepared for the Vanguard's final strike. They underestimated how much willpower was left in the crew of a ship that refused to die. And now, they would feel the consequences. The Vanguard unleashed everything it had, targeting the human fleet with brutal precision. The human ships began to falter, unable to keep up with the onslaught. It was chaos, pure chaos. The humans retaliated, but they were outmatched. The tide was turning, and the Vanguard was making it happen. Then, with a final, blinding flash, the last human ship in the fleet exploded. The Vanguard had done it. Against all odds, they had struck the final blow. Lennox stood there, staring at the smoldering remains of the human fleet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The Vanguard had won. But at what cost? The ship was in ruins, the crew barely able to stand after the battle. There were injuries, there was damage, and yet, against all odds, they had done it. The Vanguard had survived. "We did it," the tactical officer said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We won." Lennox nodded slowly, his heart heavy with the weight of the sacrifice. "Yes, we won. But let's make sure the galaxy knows one thing. Never underestimate us. Earth's wrath is not something you can take lightly." As the Vanguard drifted in space, its engines sputtering, its crew exhausted but victorious, they knew one thing for sure. Earth had made its mark, and it would never be forgotten.